Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for joining us for Stars of Franchising.
Get ready for a roller coaster ride through the world of franchising as we bring you the best stories of inspiration and entrepreneurial grit and turning dreams into franchise realities.
That's right, Vinny. From emerging to global brands, we'll chat with the genius minds behind the magic. All brought to you by the Tariq Farid Franchise Institute at Babson College. I'm Ab.
And I'm Vini. Now, buckle up for some serious inspiration.
Got a special, unbelievable guest here, Nigel Travis, of former COO of Blockbuster, Papa John's CEO, Chairman CEO of Dunkin Brands. Just came from class. We had some great discussion with our Babson MBAs. Welcome, Nigel.
Well, I'm really happy to be here. This is always my longest journey. I live 1.3 miles away, so Babson's in a good place for me. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Nigel, for honoring our invitation. And we're going to kick off this episode by just asking you to explain or to describe what do you think people misunderstood the most about franchising.
Okay, so you're right. That's a good word, misunderstood. And I think it's interesting. If you look at the history of franchising, it's grown over the years. At one stage, I think, like 20 years ago, some people even thought it was slightly illegal. It's like a Ponzi scheme. Nothing could be further from the truth. I think there are bad franchisors out there. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to name them today, but I know there's very bad franchisors because when I was the CEO of Dunkin, twice I went to California to argue against some new franchising law, and they told me all these horror stories of some of these brands. So there are people who do bad things, and I think rightly the legislators come in and try and do something about it. But getting back to the core of your question, Vinny, franchising is a great business. It's a business where people can start small, and today we had the pleasure of one of the Dunkin franchisees, who happens to be one of my best friends, Neil Faulkner, was here. And I think the lesson he gave the class was you start with one store and then you scale it. So I think franchising is not just, and this is another point we made, it's not just quick service restaurants. Franchising can be everywhere. And in my retirement, I do lots of things, but one of them is I'm chairman of ServPro, 100% franchise. So as franchises for very small investment, 30, 40,000. There's franchises that are a lot more expensive, like Dunkin. And I think the most important thing is that people need to select what is right for their needs. You need to be very careful about the people you work with. But franchising, if it's done properly, is a fantastic business, and I think it will continue to grow, not just here in the US, because most great brands manage to expand internationally. So,
thank you.
And that's great. We will definitely come back to that international piece and the scalability and the way people and entrepreneurs can use franchising, not only here in the United States and North America, but internationally. So the next question is going to be around, failure and resilience and making change. And one question I have for you is whether it's with something that happened in a brand before you got there or while you were there. Can you talk about a failure that you overcame and what you learned from that experience?
Well, yeah, this is a good one. When I was at Blockbuster, and it wasn't actually franchising, but it could have been, I took over Europe, and we had one store in Europe, joint venture in Germany. Blockbuster, and I'm sure even your younger students somehow remember Blockbuster.
I think so.
And we opened in Germany, but Germany has some very strange rules. We couldn't open on a Sunday. We couldn't open on holidays. Most of the German industry showed porn. Blockbuster had a very strict no porn categorization of its product. So we went to Germany. We struggled, and we struggled. And I had a boss who said to me one day, and it's a dreadful phrase, Nigel, sometimes you have to kill your own babies. And And I learned from that you've got to stand back from a business, look at it, say, well, how realistically is it going to be successful? And sometimes you have to decide it's not going to be. So you have to, as they say, cut bait. Mm-hmm. That was a big lesson. And I think as I came to Dunkin, we had 2,000 stores that were unprofitable. And someone asked me in the class today, did we close many stores? We closed some, mm-hmm. but we tried to tackle the problems by working with the franchisees and tackling it. So I think the big lesson from this is you've got to stand back from a situation, assess what's right or wrong, and then go in, but take the people with you to solve it.
Interesting. Now, let me piggyback on that, Nigel. If you could take a look at what you've sort of lived through in your career, in the franchising world so far, do you know of any myth or more that people have out there that is not really true, and you sort of want to help us to demystify something in the franchising world?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what I'd say about that is that franchising, most people, if you went and did a survey, I've never done one, if you went and did a survey, most people wouldn't know what franchising is. I think that's one thing. And I think that's something we need to do. And I think the courses you're running here are part of that process of trying to demystify, to use your word, Vinny. I think one of the most important things in franchising, and I think most franchisors get it right, but there are some who don't, is I think, and Neil said it very nicely in our stage, it needs to be a balance.
Yeah.
I mean, it needs to be a balance. And one of the things that I talked about is that my background was in labor relations. And so I dealt with unions. And the unions obviously have a different set of goals in life and do the employees from the company. A lot of people always say, oh, we're in it all together. But I've applied the same thinking to franchising, and I think you have to say, okay, the franchisees have a set of profit and goals. The company have a set of goals. They're at conflict sometimes. Yeah. If you increase royalties, you're taking out the pocket of franchisees and they're going to the company. Mm-hmm. Recognize it's different and bridge the gap. So I think it comes down to a lot of human skills. Mm-hmm. I think that's misunderstood, and we talked a lot about that today and probably could have talked about it some more. So I think the skills in franchising require a lot of soft skills. Yeah. I think another myth out there is that franchisees are all difficult. Mm-hmm. But I have a simple belief in life that franchisors create bad franchisees. Yep. And my favorite phrase is you get the franchisors get the franchisees they deserve. And it's like if you're a manager of a department, if you treat people badly, they will respond negatively. Right. So treat everyone with respect, get their opinion, etc., etc.
Well, to build on that a little bit, we talked about in class, and I love the discussion around how you actually made change given the franchise structure and the model. Can you talk a little bit about those two situations, both at Papa John's, when you talked about the franchisee dissatisfaction, and then at Dunkin', and about that connection to what you just mentioned, Nigel, about relationships, trust, and turning the ship, so to speak?
Well, actually, Dunkin' was probably the more interesting one. The other one's a bit more fun. So I'll tell the serious one first. Okay. So Dunkin', we had a situation where we had a lot of franchisees losing money, as I said earlier. It was in the Great Recession. I went there at a perfect time, I would say, 2009, mm-hmm. January 2009. Franchisees were really concerned. I did so-called listening tour. Mm-hmm. And then we had meetings with the representative councils. But very quickly I realized that the company had been making money out of the franchisees being delivered lawsuits for all kinds of things. It was like a profit center on litigation. Mm-hmm. So I decided to change that. I changed the reporting from legal to finance. We set up a loss protection committee with the franchisees so that we're in it together. Yep. There are bad franchisees out there. Let me say that. Yeah. And sometimes people do need to be punished, but let's not overdo it. So we did that, and I think that changed the tone. Or as I say in my book, that created the spark. And I think the franchisees understood then that I'd listened to them, I'd thought about it, and we came up with a solution together. The more exciting one was Papa John's. So I went to Papa John's where franchisees gave management a 15% rating, so pretty low.
Pretty low.
And we had a convention very early in my tenure, and we heard that Dave Brandon, who's actually a good friend, the CEO at Domino's, has said that Papa John's is public enemy number one. So
it was your main competitor telling you that.
Yeah. And it was interesting. I asked the students what they thought of that.
Yeah.
And a lot of them say, well, you should feel proud of it, that they regard you so highly. But it took some nudges to get someone to say, well, we should be concerned about it. Mm-hmm. So you should feel the competitive urge to respond.
Right.
Ironically, I went back to my room that night, saw on TV that Domino's were proposing to sponsor the Apprentice program with Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So I went back down. We had a dinner with the franchisees at this conference, and I stood up and I said, I've got an idea, guys. I think as Domino's are going to sponsor this show, we should find some way to interrupt Domino's sponsorship. And they all said, yeah, that's a good idea. So we worked on these ads. We got ads out in 2 weeks. And the net result was we bought all the media locally, not nationally.
Yeah.
We placed these ads in the middle of Domino's sponsored program.
Right.
And we talked about the meatball pizza. And in the middle of it, John Schneider, who was the then chairman and the voice of the brand, turned around and he said, why buy your pizza from an apprentice when you can buy it from the experts at Papa John's? And he spun the chair around and said, to the competition, you're fired.
Yes. And what did that do?
The franchisees loved it.
Yeah.
I mean,
spark.
That I was on their side because, I mean, you talk about things that people don't understand in franchising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think there's a way to really galvanize. That's a great word. Galvanize the system. I mean, if you watch sports programs, behind the scenes, you see the coaches trying to galvanize their players before they go on the field. You have to do that with franchisees. Right. They want to be led. And I know you've had all this experience. I think you'd agree that.
Yeah, definitely. And I love it because, you asked the class and, what do you think? What do you think they felt? And to me, it was, he's got my back. So I think it's credibility and trust. Mm-hmm. I'm going to follow him like any great coach. I will follow. It's going to tell me, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go after him. I got your bat. I'm going to get in front of you in the media. Mm-hmm. I love the analogy. And I think you're exactly right. I think the relationships between the franchisor and the franchisee and that healthy tension, if they're understanding of that, and as you expressed, Nigel, today, and so often to just put that out there, then I've got an extra teammate. Mm-hmm. That I would love.
And the power of the system.
Yes.
The power of the franchise. But I think you mentioned something. I think you brought it up about trust. I have a simple phrase, which I learned from a boss when I was at Burger King. I trust people until they let me down. Most people go the other way around. And I firmly believe 98% of people do not aim to do the wrong thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just my observation, if I'm a franchisee and I see that and I hear it and I feel it, and there's give and take, that goes a long way that, hey, I'm going to make that new investment in the new oven that Nigel and the team are talking about because, there is this mutual trust. So I love those examples.
Let's take the trust issue you just mentioned, Nigel. If you look at your days as a franchisor, what would you think the best franchisors do? And then you go to the other side, the franchisees that you've had to deal with. What are the things that the great franchisees do so well? Okay,
so the first thing I would say is I think you have to think like a retailer in our business. Mm-hmm. I mean, sales are important. Nothing's more important than sales.
Right.
And if I had to be critical of franchisees, I think too many of them think costs first and revenue second. So everyone jokes about the fact that I get up at like 5:30 in the morning and all that stuff, and I look at the numbers. You've got to be on top of the numbers. So that's the first thing. You've got to know what's going on, and you've got to have a good idea. I mean, everything I do is about numbers at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is you cannot spend all your time in an office. And so if you're a franchisor, you need to be out in the field. And I had a rule, which is well before the pandemic. I only expected you to be in the office one day of the week.
Yeah.
I expected you to be out in the field, working with franchisees, looking at stores, solving problems the rest of the week. And I did a lot of travel. I mean, the last few years I was at Dunkin, which was before the pandemic, I did 140 flights a year, domestically and internationally. So you've got to be out there. I mean, effectively, they're your customers, so you've got to do that. Now, turn it around the other way, the franchisee, and I think Neil did a great description of this today.
He did.
You have to be in the stores. I mean, the stores are where the customers are. I mean, where people come in, and I can tell you right now, in every Dunkin' store, something's going wrong.
Yeah.
So you need to know, you need to get rid of, and we talked about it today, I had a problem with a vending machine here at Babson. That was friction.
Yes.
Anything that gets in the way of the customer transacting. I'll mention it. You've got a Starbucks downstairs. Starbucks, in my view, are incredibly slow with their product.
Yeah.
And you kindly bought me a coffee.
Took us
it took a long time.
At least 4 minutes.
And friction, I think. So you've got to be out in the stores. You've got to solve problems. Staffing is obviously a huge issue for every business right now. So you need to be out there, encouraging people, supporting them. And I think to add to that question, labour turnover in the restaurant industry is horrific. Some people have as much as 250%. The average cost per employee in the industry of turnover is $5,800. So if you per employee, so if you turn over people 5 times, which is 250%, that means you're spending about $27,000 a year on lost productivity, and I think you need to be really working on the people side as well.
So that's an interesting piece of advice and observation. I spoke to Neil. I called him in preparation for this last weekend, and as Nigel stated, he's a successful Dunkin' franchisee. He owns 32 stores. I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And it was a Saturday. He said, "I'm making sandwiches. I've got labor challenges," but he's in a store, and he's an example of a great operator. He serves on advisory committees, and I think that leads me to a little bit on the next question, which maybe expand on successful traits, Nigel, and attributes of great operators and great leaders. And you talked about it in class, that relationship and things you could do to not only keep your employees as a franchisee, but also empower your team as a franchisor. And maybe a few things from your great book on what advice you have for traits, leadership-wise.
Okay, so people say, and I'm sure we've all heard it a lot, well, as the Great Resignation, as people leaving the workforce, you can't do anything about it. You can. And just before I retired as CEO, we had a meeting in Las Vegas, and we had a bunch of international franchisees. And a franchisee, Baskin-Robbins franchisee from Vietnam, said, you can do a lot about labor turnover. And this guy had a 2% labor turnover. And I said, well, I don't believe it. So he produced the numbers, and yes, it was 2%. So what did he do? It was nothing clever. He did everything right. He recruited the best people. He paid them the best money, which a lot of people don't do.
Yeah.
He treated them right. They had competitions, and every week they'd go out for a pizza party or something because they'd hit the goals. He trained them right. There was nothing that was revolutionary. It was all the basics. So I think the first piece of advice, focus on your people. The second thing is leaders need to listen.
You talked about that,
and we talked a lot about that in the class today. And there's a great book which I think every Babson students should read because it applies across the whole of everything you do here.
Right.
Is You're Not Listening by Kate Murphy, who's a New York Times journalist. We all think we're pretty good listeners. Most of us are awful, including me.
Right.
We can improve, and she talks about how you can teach people to improve their listening, but that is one big thing. You need to listen to the franchisees if you're a franchisor. The franchisees need to listen to their employees in the store. The store managers need to listen to their employees. And most of all, turn it around and listen to your customers. So never stop listening, I think, is one. But the true one is engagement. Yeah. You've got to engage with people, and that's where listening is right front and center. And talk to people about how they can solve problems together.
Well, I loved your example. If you could just, and I'm going to, while we have it, talk about ways to build trust with your employees, and specifically, creating an environment where they feel safe, and bringing up some questions. Or you talk a little bit about that.
This is straight take out the book. I mean, on the employee side, I used to run these things called coffee chats. Mm-hmm. When I was at Papa John's, we used to call them Tea Time with Nigel, and it'd be a diagonal slice. Just to explain what that is, I used to do people below VP level, so it'd be director and below. I'd take a people out of every level below and every function. So you wouldn't be with a bunch of finance people. Right. It would be cross-functional and cross-level. And then we get them in the room, and the goal initially is to make them feel safe. We're going to take notes, but we're not going to say it's Vinny or Ab talking about it. Right. It's just someone, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have to warm them up. So you give them some easy questions, and they say, okay, let's really talk about the key issues. And I used to put some examples on the table. I used to say, okay, if you really wanted to know what's going on, you'd ask questions like, is Dunkin going to be bought? Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that. Or is Dunkin going to buy someone? Mm-hmm. And the one that really got everyone going was when I said, okay, so Harvey Weinstein's out there with all his alleged issues.
Right.
Do we have to be concerned at Dunkin? Wow, that started some discussion going, and 3 or 4 people went to HR after that as a result because they were concerned about things. So you need to find a way to untap people, but make them feel safe at the same time. And the coffee chats were very successful. You learn a lot because there's stuff that you don't know about. And then you also should act on it. I mean, we changed the family leave policy when I was there as a result of what I heard in these. Because there was a bunch of women in one of these groups. Yeah. And they got on to how difficult it was to have kids and manage it all. Mm-hmm. It's been better documented since that time, and childcare and how difficult that was. So we changed the policy as a result of that. And I really think that's a great practice.
Great.
But Nigel, you spoke about your book. I'm not sure whether we captured. Was it the title of the book? And then what sort of motivated you to put all your insights into the book? Yeah.
The book's called The Challenge Culture, and basically the motivation was simple. Over time, and I've been working for now 52 years, and I've collected a lot of experiences, but also collected a lot of great things that people said. Mm-hmm. I mean, I had a boss once who kept talking about, we don't want a tidy graveyard. Now, that sounds horrific.
We don't want to tidy the graveyard.
So a tidy graveyard means making everything go into straight lines, right? Mm-hmm. And he said, and what he wanted to do, the world is confused and muddled. Recognize it's like that. Yeah. So don't expect everything to be tied up into little neat packages. So I had all these things. I had a way of operating. So a lot of people said, I think you should put all this down. So eventually I did when I was getting towards retirement.
Right.
And I had an agent. Then I hired a really great writer. And sadly he died of a heart attack at the start of the pandemic, but he and I had great conversations, and he wrote it all down. So, any good writing in the book is not down to me; it's down to him.
You had the story,
and we had fun, but it was good. And it's interesting that a lot of things since I wrote the book have changed because of the pandemic, but I got some things right. I wrote in the book that we will all move to a 4-day work week.
Oh, you did.
So this was in 2018, because I said commuting was ridiculous, and it's amazing how close we are now.
Right.
You talked about change during the pandemic. Nigel, is there something else that happened during the pandemic that you think is going to sort of shape the future of franchising moving forward?
Yeah, I had an interesting experience. This must have been about May or June 2020. And because of my background, everyone was going into running sessions online, right?
Right, right.
I mean, I got invited to several a week, round tables they called them, and you go on there, it was like 30 people, right?
Right.
So I went on this franchise one, which I wasn't keen to go because I didn't know any of the brands. They were all really small franchise brands. But I went on and there was one guy who taught me a lot. And he basically had a business. I can't remember how many locations he had, but it wasn't a lot. And he said he spoke to every employee every day.
Wow.
And that was his job, talking to his people.
Checking in.
Yeah. And I think what I learned from that is, and obviously if you've got 50,000 stores, it's a bit difficult to do, but someone has a smaller number, is the attention on individuals. And we all know that the pandemic created dreadful mental health.
Yeah.
I mean, we haven't talked about it on here, but I'm chairman and joint owner of a football club in England, and we started having a weekly call with the players and everyone because they're people who have a free time. Mental health's a big issue in sports, so it happens in the franchising world as well. And then you had all these horrific problems, the pandemic calls, that people are in small homes.
Right.
They're trying to do conference calls.
Kids and pets.
Everything. It was awful. So I think I learned just by listening to that, focus on every individual. Don't think of communications as talking to a group.
Right.
And that was very powerful. It probably doesn't apply directly to franchising. It applies to everything.
It does. Which I think is we're learning and we're trying to share that a lot of these lessons and stories are leadership, people, management, entrepreneurship, and it's not limited to franchising. So that's fascinating. I guess one other thing I'd like to talk about, and we've been discussing this intersection of community and impact that franchising can have. And I saw a recent article, or I think recent, that you wrote or were involved with Stanford on sustainability or social issues or impact, I think. Can you talk a little bit about maybe diversity, equity, inclusion, social impact, and sustainability, and either some best practices you saw within franchising or today where we are with the challenges facing? Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, if your listeners haven't recognized it, like Vinny, I don't come from these parts, and come from the UK. And when I first moved over here, and I've moved to the States twice, so I'm here for good now, I lived in Miami, and I was the head of HR at Burger King. And we had horrendous problems because the prior management, before the company got bought, had a really bad relationship with the African-American franchisees and African-American employees. So they were actually as a group called Operation Push, which was run by Jesse Jackson's pressure group, and there'd been a push covenant on the back of a push boycott of Burger King. So they had this covenant, but Burger King hadn't done much to comply with the covenant. So I inherited this problem, and it was amazing. There was me and all these African-American reverends. They were very religious in Chicago. We worked on this, and I spent hours working on it, and it was developing, going back to our earlier theme, mutual trust.
Mutual trust.
I didn't know a lot about their lives. I learned a lot. I learned that they had some prejudices as well. We talked about that. And I'm really proud that at the end of it, the Push Covenant, which was just about African Americans, by the time we finished the work, we moved it to a diversity council to embrace everyone. So I think there's an awful lot of debate. We're sitting here when the Supreme Court's talking about affirmative action in colleges. I think some of it's got way out of hand, got way out of whack. I truly believe the benefit of diversity is to get the different opinions. And I think one of the problems is that people categorize it too tightly. I mean, there's a tendency in this country to think of ethnic groups as Hispanic and African American. Now, that means you forget Asians. I think Asians are the big forgotten group in this country, and there's probably a lot here on the campus at Babson. Indians, sometimes people don't classify them at all, but they seem to be classified here as Asians. But I think the power of diversity is you need all kinds of thought. You need different political backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. I think international people like Vinny and I can add a lot to America. So I think diversity has to be diversity of thought and opinion. And I think that truly adds value because you see things from different angles.
Yeah.
And I think every problem is like 360. You need to see it all the way around. Yeah. And that's the power of diversity.
Wow. That's powerful, Nigel. When you look at what is going on in the world today with technology, social issues, politics, political, if there's a trend that you want to pick out, I think this trend, watch out, it's going to change the world of franchising. What would that be?
Well, I think it already has. Is technology and automation. I think the pandemic made us think different about a lot of things, and I think the fact that we're all struggling to find labour means we have to think differently.
Yeah.
So I think automation should be embraced. It shouldn't be the Luddites of the Industrial Revolution. It should be embraced. I think, you can get into a really fascinating discussion about immigration, which I think needs to be tackled. And the problems of immigration are not only here in the US, but in the UK.
Yeah.
I won't go down the political route, but both countries lack labour, and many people could come from other countries and see the opportunity to work in great countries like the UK and the US. But I think using automation, and it's funny, after I wrote my book, I started getting a few books to review, and I read this book called Friction. I've forgotten who the author was, but this was about friction and everything. And friction is simple. Today, I went down to try and get a coffee here at Babson, and the coffee machine wouldn't work. I tried everything. I was there. I got students to help me, and they couldn't get it to work either. That is friction. Anything that stops the customer getting what they want is friction. And friction occurs in just about everything. The answer is automation or technology. So franchisees tend to be this is a generalization, but I think it's true. Franchisees tend to be very cautious about it, very conservative about it. And I think Neil said that today. So I think franchisees in any franchise business need to embrace it. At ServPro, there's a lot of technology stuff. For instance, we go into a basement, say, that's had a flood, and you have to try and sketch out what you're working on to cost out the job. We've now got automatic tools for doing that, which saves a lot of time.
And helps the franchisee.
Yes, it makes it simpler and speeds up the job.
Which leads to more jobs, more money for them.
So I think a much greater embracement. And we've seen what's happened with technology in schools. I mean, the kids can all work every kind of computer. Social media, we've seen what's happened there. The thing that I say sometimes in big groups, today is the slowest day you will ever see. Because the world's going to continue to speed up.
It's not stopping.
And I think you have to open your mind to technology more and more.
Interesting.
I think you're right, and it points to a lot of changes, and the best brands and people and leaders embrace that, as you stated, Nigel. Before I turn over the last question on entrepreneurship to Vinny, I do want to ask you, what do you think the future of franchising holds, and are you bullish, and where are we on the spectrum and the pendulum on its opportunity in this world?
Well, it employs a lot of people. Don't think I've had a lot of discussion over time with government officials, both parties. don't get it.
They don't get it.
They don't get it at the state level. So I think the IFA, and I think Babson was involved in the IFA at the start, does a pretty good job, but we need to try and get franchising out there to be understood as a strong business that it is. But I'm very bullish. I mean, I think if it comes down to how you treat people. I mean, franchisees are your customers.
Yeah.
Treat them with respect. We tried to do that at Dunkin', it worked. I tried to do it at Papa John's, it worked. ServPro had a great culture about treating the franchisees right before Blackstone bought the company. I think franchising will grow and grow. And just to repeat what I think I already said, it's not just in food.
Yes.
It's in all kinds of businesses. And I think the only other thing I'd say is a lot of people franchise their brands too early.
Yeah.
I think you need solid, steady experience, and you don't suddenly do one store and think you cracked it.
Well, yeah. Before I turn, I mean that's fascinating because we talk about it with the students, and so what one store I'm ready to sell, sell the whole country because there's this misperception, right, that you're making a lot of money as a young franchisor. In your mind, Nigel, is there, what do you need to have shown? Multiple stores and locations outside a region. I mean, you took Dunkin', strong Northeastern brand. What advice would you have for early stage franchisors about growing too quickly and what they need to do to make sure they're ready for that?
I think firstly you need to have a good lawyer because franchising law is misunderstood as well.
Definitely.
And there's a big specialization. And I think you then need to make sure it's replicable. It's a tough word to say. Replicable. Got it out in the end. And I think you make an interesting point. One of the things we talked about in the class, we talked about a lot of stuff. The more I think
we did. We covered. We could have gone for an hour more, but I had to give up the classroom.
Regions. I mean, regions are different, and this country is much more complicated. I mean, what works in Louisiana doesn't work in Massachusetts and doesn't work in California. So I think you need, I'm not going to say a magic number, but you need some experience to show that it can move from state to state. I think the other thing we talked about right at the end is marketing.
Right.
You cannot cut corners on marketing. And one of the good things with franchising is the money for marketing comes from the franchisees. You can't cut it.
Yeah.
And I work with company operations where the easiest thing to cut is marketing.
Yeah.
And franchising kind of has that protection, which most people don't think about.
Yeah.
And I think you just have to keep banging out the message. And every time I go downtown Boston, I see on the way down there a billboard, beautiful digital billboard that says ServPro.
Yeah. Well, I think that's music to my colleague's professor in marketing's ears here.
It's, because, there's a great segue into trying to allow give you the opportunity to address this last question. Here is Babson. We're at Babson. We've been, for the past 26, 27 years now, number one in all rankings, number one in entrepreneurship. And when Ab came in and they have this franchise institute, they said, what does entrepreneurship going to do with franchising? You guys going nuts? So I pose the same question to you. Are these two strange bedfellows? Entrepreneurship, franchising, or the other way? What's going on?
No, I think it's part of entrepreneurship, and a lot of people never think about it. I mean, Babson, I don't just say this because I live around the corner, but as I've talked to a lot of people, Babson has a fantastic reputation, and franchising is a real growth area. So I think it's a great bedfellows. I think what I'd like to challenge Babson to do is make sure that potential franchisors know that they have a responsibility to the whole industry to run it well. Goes back to what I said at the start. When you go to California and you hear about bad franchisors, let's make sure they're not Babson graduates.
Yeah. And I love it. I mean, that's great advice because you're right. It's a battle, right? The horror stories.
Yeah.
But there's plenty more 10 times that are positive stories. So what great advice. Thank you to our guest, Nigel Travis. Unbelievable discussion today in the classroom. You're amazing. The book is Challenge Culture.
Challenge Culture.
The Challenge Culture. We encourage all of you to read it. Take this advice. Go create some ventures and grow some businesses. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you. Thank you, Nigel. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Stars of Franchising.
Stars of Franchising was produced at Babson College, engineered by Travis Gray. Karen Soa is our guest coordinator, and music by Ralph Taylor.
If you like Stars of Franchising, be sure to review us wherever you get your podcasts and spread the word and share these stories any way you can.